Number 1.
This case holds an enduring fascination in Finland. There are many factors that led to this. The teenage female victim, who was known as a religious and innocent person, was killed close to her rural home. The media frenzy at the time and later over the murder. And, of course, the fact that the case remains unsolved after almost 70 years. On Sunday, May 17, 1953, 17-year-old Kyllikki, pronounced Kyllikki, Saari, went to church as normal. On returning at about 1 p.m., she said she felt tired, but that she would still go to a youth prayer meeting in another village in the evening. She went to rest. At 6 p.m. Kyllikki left to cycle the 40 minutes south on dirt roads to Kortenkilla village schoolhouse, where the youth prayer meeting would take place. She had borrowed her older sister Auli's gloves and scarf to wear. She said a cheerful "well, bye then" to her mother as she left. After the meeting, Kyllikki and her female friend Maiju set off on their bicycles at about 10 p.m. Their journey home was 13.5 kilometers, 8.3 miles, or about a 40-minute bike ride north. It would not have been fully dark, even though the evening was cloudy, as that far north in mid-May the sun does not set until after 10:20 p.m. Maiju and Kyllikki lived in different directions, so they needed to separate partway into their homeward journey. Kyllikki seemed nervous to make the rest of the journey alone, but she reassured Maiju, and probably also herself, that surely this journey would be no different from how it had always been. Probably it goes now as it has before. Bye then, Maiju. The girls separated at a fork in the road at about 10:30 p.m., and Kyllikki set off to cycle north on Kauhajoki Road. 6 kilometers, 3.3 miles, of unlit dirt road bordered by forest separated Kyllikki from her home. She never arrived. Auli Kyllikki Saari, known as Kyllikki, was born in 1935, on December 6, Finnish Independence Day. She lived with her parents and 5 siblings on a farm 10 kilometers, 6.2 miles, north of the village of Isajoki, western Finland. The area where Kyllikki and her family lived was rural, made up of farms and small villages. The landscape was flat and boggy, a patchwork of cultivated farmland and pine and birch forests. Kyllikki had 2 older brothers, Kalevi and Esko, and 3 sisters, Auli and Heli, who were older than her, and Rita, the baby of the family, who was 13 when Kyllikki went missing. The Saari family owned some land and a small area of forest. The sons of the family worked with their father. The family's younger son, Esko, had left school at age 11 to begin work, and the family made its living from the land. The large family got on well together, and Kyllikki was a lively, sporty, and happy child despite growing up during the Second World War. In the spring of 1950, Kyllikki, then aged 14, had a cycling accident on a country road. She suffered a concussion and was in hospital in nearby Isajoki for 2 weeks. When she came home she stayed in bed for another 4 weeks. After the accident, Kyllikki complained of a buzzing sensation in her head, especially if she had been working hard and suffered from headaches. The accident meant Kyllikki gave up the studies she had started after completing her primary school education, equivalent to grades 1-5 in the US. On September 1, 1952, Kyllikki began working at the office of the local Evangelical Lutheran Church parish in Isajoki. She was asked to do this job by the parish pastor, who had also confirmed her as a member of the church in June 1952. Kyllikki seemed to enjoy her work and to get on well with her boss, the pastor. Kyllikki occasionally even stayed over at the parsonage. On May 1, 1953, the pastor moved away from Isajoki 40 kilometers, 25 miles, south to another parish. Kyllikki, however, continued to work in Isajoki. The two would write to each other. By the spring of 1953, it was planned that Kyllikki would travel to the city of Seinäjoki to have some tests done. She still felt a humming in her head and had headaches. Kyllikki's older sister Auli thought that Kyllikki became more religious after her accident, but their father thought she had always been religiously inclined. Kyllikki did not attend the local dances or other entertainments with her older siblings and did not, to her family's knowledge, have any boyfriends. She had told an older female friend who lived in the same village that she had no interest in men and did not want to get married. Kyllikki's family had not been worried when she hadn't arrived home after the prayer meeting. They assumed she had stayed over with her friend Maiju. On Monday, when Kyllikki didn't come home, they assumed she was staying over in Isajoki to be close to her workplace. Her parents reported her missing to the police when they found out from the Isajoki parsonage on the evening of Tuesday, May 19, that Kyllikki had not been at work for the last 2 days. On Wednesday, May 20, with still no sign of Kyllikki, the police organized a search of the area where she and Maiju had parted ways, which was conducted by about 30 men. They found no trace of her. On May 21, a huge search was organized involving about 600 local people. They again found no trace of Kyllikki. As word spread about the missing teenager, a local man nicknamed Tai Jaska, Road Jaska, a road worker, came forward to say that he had cycled past Kyllikki in the opposite direction at about 10:40 p.m. about 1.5 kilometers, 1 mile, north from the junction where she had separated from her friend Maiju. Tai Jaska was the last person to have seen Kyllikki alive and well. 2 more locals, a farmer and his son, also came forward to say that, early on the morning of May 18, they had spotted some car and bicycle tire tracks and some broken glass on the dirt road where Kyllikki vanished. The large-scale search continued without success until, on July 22, 2 local berry pickers, a grandmother and granddaughter, found Kyllikki's bicycle submerged in the remote Lelyulakso bog, less than 1 kilometer, 0.6 miles, southeast of where Kyllikki was last seen by Tai Jaska. The valves on the tires had been removed so the bicycle would sink into the bog. The bicycle was found in an area that had already been searched. It was in good condition. This made it likely that the bike had not been in the water and exposed to the weather since May 17 when Kyllikki went missing, but had been placed there later in hopes it would disappear into the bog. The fact that the bicycle was in good condition also meant that Kyllikki had probably not been hit or run over by a car. 2.5 months after the discovery of Kyllikki's bicycle, on Friday, October 9, 1953, a local man found Kyllikki's right shoe. Her sister's chiffon scarf, which she had been wearing when she went missing, and a man's sock were inside the shoe. The shoe had been there for a while, as the moss underneath it was dead. However, the area had been planted with tree saplings at the start of June, and the shoe had not been spotted then, making it likely it was placed there after this time. It was a little after 10 a.m. on Sunday, October 11, 1953, when the shout echoed out to the between 200-300 people searching for Kyllikki. Line, stop. A 26-year-old farmer taking part in the search had found something. Kyllikki's remains had been discovered. She was buried in a peat bog 193 meters, 633 feet, through the woods from the road she had been cycling along the night she went missing. A thin, sharpened pine branch had been driven into the soft ground to mark the spot. The stick had pierced her body. Kyllikki's father and elder brother Kalevi, who were part of the search party, identified her remains. Kyllikki's coat was wrapped around her head. Her cause of death was probably either blunt force trauma to the face, her nose and cheekbones were broken, or suffocation. Her body was naked from the waist down. It could not be determined whether or not she had been sexually assaulted. It seemed the stick had been placed to mark the grave later, as it had not been noticed during previous searches and appeared freshly cut. It had been sharpened by someone left-handed. Kyllikki's elder brother Esko was one of the people who carried her body away from the swamp surrounded by a large crowd of local people, including children. Today, the spot where Kyllikki's body was found is marked by a simple stone memorial erected in 1987 by Kyllikki's older sister Auli and is even signposted as Kyllikki Saari's swamp grave. On October 14, Kyllikki's left shoe was discovered. Her wristwatch, red cloth purse, and hymn book have never been found. The Kyllikki's funeral was held at Isajoki Church on the afternoon of Sunday, October 25, 1953. Her white, flower-covered coffin traveled from the Saari family home to Isajoki in a flatbed truck along with her family. This journey and the funeral service were filmed by Finnish national broadcaster Yle. Such was the publicity surrounding her murder that an estimated 25,000 people attended the funeral, more than 4 times the local population. Kyllikki was given a Lutheran burial in Isajoki Cemetery in a plot opposite the main door of the church. Her mother, who died in 1992, her father, who died in 1993, and her older brother Kyllikki, who died in 2010, are now buried with Kyllikki in Isajoki Cemetery. According to Kyllikki's older sister Auli, Kyllikki was strong and had good arm strength. It could not have been a weak man who had killed her. As Kyllikki's body was found almost 200 meters (656 feet) from the road, her killer would also have had to have been strong enough to carry her body that distance and to then dig and refill her half-meter (1.6 foot) deep grave. Rumors circulated locally, nationally, and in the Finnish press as to who the culprit might be. Several people made false confessions and several prisoners said they had information to give, but only if they could be taken out of prison for a day trip to visit the area where the crime took place. Private detectives and clairvoyants also added their opinions. Over the years, police interviewed almost 5,000 people, and there were 370 different lines of investigation by 1972. The police even traced former residents of Isajoki who had moved to Sweden after the murder. At the time, the Finnish press published the names of those they considered suspects, something which is not done today. Nowadays in Finland, even when convicted of a crime, the guilty party is not named unless they are already a public figure such as a politician, or there is some other pressing reason to name them. In 1953, however, it seems that the Finnish media was able to freely publish any and all speculation about Kyllikki's abduction and murder, naming names and pointing fingers. No one has ever been charged in the case. The main suspects were Kyllikki's employer, and the person who had confirmed her into the Lutheran Church was what we would today call a sexual predator. He was known to sexually assault underage and young women, including his parishioners and servants. 3 years after Kyllikki's murder, he was sentenced for having sex with a 15-year-old girl. Had he sexually assaulted and then murdered Kyllikki? Police ruled him out due to his alibi. He had been at a church event 64 kilometers (40 miles) away on the evening Kyllikki vanished. He could not drive. All but 20 minutes of his evening and night were accounted for by multiple alibis. In his 2021 book, Teemu Keskisarja, a respected celebrity historian in Finland specializing in dark history, puts forward his theory that Kyllikki was living a secret life and that there was some kind of sexual relationship between the pastor and Kyllikki which involved him coercing her into sexual activity with him. Keskisarja thinks it possible that the pastor could have traveled to meet her on the night she died. Vittori lived and worked just a couple of kilometers, about a mile, from the crime scene. He was in his mid-late 30s at the time of the murder and working as an odd job man and ditch digger, so he was fit and strong. Vittori was an alcoholic who had mental health problems, likely what we would today class as PTSD, caused or worsened by his service during World War II. He had engaged in antisocial behavior and also had a criminal record for sexual assault. He was arrested whilst Kyllikki was still a missing person. His full name, occupation, and place of residence, Isajoki, were published in the Finnish press. He was also referred to in press reports as the ditch digger. During his police interrogation, Vittori said that Kyllikki was dead and that her body would never be found. Police believed he had had help from his brother-in-law, who also had a criminal record, to bury Kyllikki. Vittori's mother and brother provided him with an alibi. They said he was passed out drunk in bed by 7 p.m. on the evening of the murder. Vittori was not charged and was later institutionalized due to his poor mental health. He died sometime before 1972, as did his brother-in-law. This 35-year-old suspect had been forced to leave the police force over what was euphemistically described as his bad lifestyle, perhaps alcoholism, and had been running a cafe close to Isajoki. He was arrested and questioned as he had allegedly been seen in a cream-colored car, which was similar to one seen by several people near the crime scene on the night in question. The ex-policeman was one of the people named and shamed in the Finnish press. In fact, he had been out drinking with friends on the night in question, far away from the Isajoki area. A local man in his 50s with mental health issues who was under the care of a guardian was another suspect. He often visited the parish office where Kyllikki worked and considered her his bride. He also harassed other local women. During the night Kyllikki went missing, he was throwing stones at the windows of Isajoki Town Hall and harassing a woman who worked there. Later that day, he attacked his guardian with a metal chain, and his guardian shot him in self-defense. The black-bearded man survived and was questioned by police, but they could not prove their theory that he was guilty. He died in a psychiatric hospital in 1971. Our final main suspect is Hans Assmann. Assmann has also been named as a suspect in the Lake Bodom murders, although he was never charged with this crime. He was a German immigrant in Finland who was also suspected of being a spy for the Soviets. Assmann's ex-wife has claimed that he and his driver were out in their cream-colored car the night Kyllikki vanished, and that Assmann had come home missing a sock and with wet shoes. She also claimed that he left home a few days later with a shovel. It seems she did not make these claims until a long time after Kyllikki's murder. A small but perhaps significant detail: Assmann was left-handed, as was whoever made the makeshift grave marker in the swamp. Police, however, ruled out Assmann as records showed he only moved to Finland later in 1953 after Kyllikki went missing. On his deathbed in 1997, Assmann made some cryptic comments to his biographer, policeman Matti Palaro, which have been interpreted by some as an admission of guilt. "One thing I can tell straight away, because it is the oldest, and that kind of accident which had to be covered up. Otherwise our trip would have been discovered. Even though my friend was a good driver, the accident could not be avoided. You know what I mean." Palaro and others took these comments to be about Kyllikki, that Assmann's driver had hit and injured or killed her with their car. They couldn't come forward as they needed to keep it a secret that they were in the Isajoki area at that time. So they hit her bicycle and buried her. Assmann died in 1998 in Sweden. The murder of Kyllikki Saari has become something of a legend in Finland and further afield. Researching this story, I came across two photos from the original 1953 police file which, more so than the more graphic photos, really struck me. The photos were of Kyllikki's black lace-up shoes. They remind us that she was an actual person who lived, who was beloved by her family, and who was abducted and murdered on her way home one spring night in Finland.
Number 2.
The mystery of 16-year-old double murder in Sweden was solved last year using data from genealogy websites, a method first used to identify and capture the Golden State Killer in 2018. Detailing the case in a new study, scientists in Sweden say it's the first time this technology has been used to catch a murderer outside the US. On October 19, 2004, an 8-year-old boy was stabbed to death while walking to school in the city of Linkoping in southern Sweden. The attacker then turned on a 56-year-old woman who had just left her home and witnessed the event, stabbing her several times and leaving her for dead. The attacker fled the scene but left behind a knitted cap and the butterfly knife he used to kill the victims. Although traces of the murder's DNA had been traced on the weapon, detectives ran out of leads and the investigation dried up. Swedish police then became aware of the arrest of Joseph James D'Angelo, the so-called Golden State Killer, using genetic information from the commercial genealogy website Gedmatch. In this notorious case, police compared genetic material left at the crime scene to the DNA of people who voluntarily submitted their gene information to public genealogy databases to trace their own family tree. This was able to identify a number of D'Angelo's family members, eventually leading them to D'Angelo himself. After following the suspect, they then picked up an unidentified object he discarded to obtain his DNA, which then linked him to a number of the crimes. The novel method proved to be a remarkable success. D'Angelo will spend the rest of his life behind bars. Intrigued by the story, Swedish police asked higher authorities whether they could solve the Linkoping murders using this DNA-based genealogy method in a pilot study. They eventually got the green light in 2019, and a new investigation got underway. Sifting through data on the platforms Gedmatch and FamilyTree, investigators found a number of distant relatives to the DNA picked up from the crime scene. A further investigation used this lead to identify two prime suspects, two brothers. More snooping revealed one of the brothers had a direct match to the crime scene DNA, affirming his guilt. The man was put on trial in 2020 and was convicted of the crime. According to local media reports, his name is Daniel Nyqvist, a Swedish man who killed the pair in an unprovoked attack while under the influence of a severe psychological disorder. Writing in a new study published in the journal Forensic Science International Genetics, researchers detail how the puzzle was put together in the hopes of inspiring investigators to crack other cold cases. As they explain, this method has been used for a growing number of crime cases, but it's never been formally described for future reference. We want to tell others about the problems that we faced when working with this pilot case and how we dealt with them. We can prevent others reinventing the wheel and make sure that the knowledge available is extended and improved. Andreas Tilmer, lead study author and adjunct senior lecturer in forensic genetics at the Department of Biomedical and Clinical Sciences at Linkoping University, said in a statement. The researchers also explain that the method, although extremely useful, is still riddled with legal and ethical dilemmas. First and foremost, many people using commercial genealogy platforms to learn about their family tree are unaware their genetic data and kinship relationships are openly available to authorities. However, if this data helps to bring murderers to justice, do the ends justify the means? There is a risk of a conflict between that two important principles, the right of the individual to privacy against the aspiration of society to solve serious crime, adds Tilmer. It's a gray area. Technology is often one step ahead of the law.
Number 3.
The best-selling true story of how an American crime writer was sucked into the long-running and bizarre police investigation of Italy's worst serial sex killer is to become a Hollywood film produced by Tom Cruise. The Monster of Florence by Douglas Preston and Mario Spizzi tells how Mr. Preston, a successful writer of crime novels, traveled to Florence and moved into a beautiful old villa on the city's outskirts. Mr. Preston's plan was to write a murder mystery set in Florence at the time of the Great Flood of 1966. It was to be entitled The Christmas Madonna and feature an American art historian who rushes to the city to help dig it out of the mud. In the process, he finds a clue to the whereabouts of a celebrated missing work by Masaccio, the painter who launched the Renaissance. But when he sets off in pursuit of the painting, he ends up being horribly murdered. Mr. Preston realized he would need to understand the workings of Italian murder investigations if his book were to ring true, and a mutual friend put him in touch with Mr. Spizzi, a crime reporter who for more than 20 years had worked the Cronaca Nera desk, black story or crime beat, at L'Nazione, the daily paper of Tuscany and central Italy. The two men met in a Florence cafe, and when Mr. Preston told Mr. Spizzi he was living in Giugoli, Spizzi's eyebrows shot up. Mr. Spizzi was Italy's greatest expert on the Monster of Florence, the serial killer armed with a .22 Beretta pistol who preyed on courting couples in their cars in quiet lanes outside the city, killing 16 of them between 1968 and 1985 and hacking off and carrying away the women's vaginas, a gruesome detail which Thomas Harris borrowed for his novel Hannibal. Mr. Spizzi had coined the term Monster of Florence, and it transpired that Mr. Preston had rented a villa overlooking the site of one of the monster's murders. All thought of the Christmas Madonna was forgotten as Mr. Preston became fascinated by the case. For the monster's crimes had never been solved. One man who was convicted and jailed was later released on appeal. Like Mr. Spizzi, Mr. Preston came to believe that the police had failed to pursue the most promising leads, and the pair began some amateur police work of their own. But in the process they drew the ire of the latest investigators, who hauled Mr. Preston in for questioning and threw Mr. Spizzi in jail, putting him under investigation on suspicion of trying to derail a criminal investigation and also on suspicion of being the monster himself. 3 weeks later he was released, the Supreme Court declaring his imprisonment illegal and destitute of any foundation. But Mr. Preston was warned that he could be rearrested if he set foot in Italy again and left the country, never to return. Tom Cruise was gripped by the Monster of Florence, which sold 300,000 copies in the US. When he met Mr. Spizzi at the Italian premiere of Valkyrie in Rome in January, he told him his character would be the star of the film. "I met Cruise with Christopher McQuarrie, his screenwriter," said Mr. Spizzi. Tom said they weren't interested in making yet another film about a serial killer, but were fascinated by the story of how two writers got caught up in the investigation and suffered the consequences. If the film stays true to the book, it will lift the lid on many disturbing aspects of Italy's justice system, in particular the willingness of police and prosecutors to put their trust in bizarre sources of information and then to punish and persecute the rare journalist like Mr. Spizzi who refused to kowtow to them. It was in 2002 that Michel Giuttari, the latest detective to head an investigation into the monster's killings, exhumed the body of Francesco Narducci, a doctor from Perugia who had drowned in Lake Trasimeno in 1985. Apparently acting on a lead provided by Gabriella Carlizzi, a psychic who claims to be fed information by a long-dead priest, the public prosecutor of Perugia, Giuliano Mignini, persuaded Mr. Giuttari that Mr. Narducci had not committed suicide but had been murdered by important Florentines because they, like Mr. Narducci, were involved in Masonic rites which centered on the monster's murders. There was not a scrap of evidence for this story, but this did not prevent the investigation from going ahead. Mr. Spizzi made no secret of the fact that he regarded the Narducci theory as bunkum. But when he and Mr. Preston began exploring the long-abandoned investigation which they believed would have led police to the true killer, Mr. Mignini, who is also the prosecutor in the Meredith Kircher murder case and who is separately fighting charges of abuse of office, came down on them hard. Mr. Preston is out of harm's way, but the judicial persecution of Mr. Spizzi by Messrs. Mignini and Giuttari continues apace. They accuse me of being the mastermind or instigator of the murder of Narducci, Mr. Spizzi said wearily. Now it's more than an investigation, I have actually been charged with the murder, also with forming a criminal association to cover up the crime, along with 23 other people in Perugia, with obstruction of justice, with perjury, and with criminal libel against Giuttari, Gabriella Carlizzi and others. I am indicted for writing articles that disturb public order because I criticized the investigation in Perugia regarding the murder of Meredith Kircher, and I am also accused of vilifying prosecutor Mignini, a criminal offense. I have the strong impression that I will never get out of this situation, and I don't know what to do. Everything I do causes Mignini to accuse me of another crime. Mr. Preston commented. It seems extraordinary that even after the Italian Supreme Court ruled that Mignini's detention of Spizzi was illegal, Mignini is still persecuting him relentlessly, without any kind of check or control. Mignini himself is on trial for abuse of office, yet he continues in office as if nothing were happening. The Monster of Florence is not just a book about a horrific serial killer, and not just a book about two journalists who fall into their own story. It is a book about modern Italy itself. Mario and I are confident that the story we tell is the truth, at least as far as the truth can be ascertained in a strange and convoluted case such as this. But this has not stopped the Italian authorities from leveling vague charges of criminal libel against us, not because there are errors in the book, but for harassment purposes and to undermine our credibility. Our aim was to tell the truth, and we told the truth at a far greater cost than we anticipated. As a result, I can probably never return to Italy, and Mario spent 3 weeks in prison and may be persecuted to the end of his days. But we both stand by what we wrote.